I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy.
I urge every American of all religions and of all colors from every section of this country to join me in that cause. At times, history and fate meet at a single time in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. Long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. For the cries of pain and the hymns and protest of oppressed people have summoned into convocation all the majesty of this great government. In our time, we have come to live with moments of great crisis. Our mission is at once the oldest and the most basic of this country. To right wrong, to do justice, to serve man. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. We are met here as Americans to solve that problem.
Please welcome Grammy-nominated blues musician Shamika Copeland.
Hello, everybody. This is a Jessie Mae Hemphill song, and I'm going to see if I can't get y'all to help me. I need all my really good finger snappers to help me out with this. You know, come on, can you guys do this for me? Come on, y'all. All right. I got some real good finger snappers out there. Lord, help the poor and needy in this land. Lord, help the poor and needy in this land, when we all rise together and face the rising sun. Lord, help the poor and needy in this land. Lord, help the motherless children in this land. Lord, help the motherless children in this land, when we all rise together and face the rising sun. Lord, help the motherless children in this land. Lord, help the lost and lonely in this land. Lord, help the lost and lonely in this land, when we all rise together and face the rising sun. Lord, help the lost and lonely in this land. Lord, help the poor and needy in this land, Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chairman of the LBJ Foundation, Larry Temple.
Tough to follow that. Good evening and welcome to this evening session on the Summit on Race in America. As they said, I'm Larry Temple, Chairman of the LBJ Foundation. Because I had the distinct privilege and honor to work for President Johnson in the White House during the last year and a half of his administration, I can say with certainty that I know that he would be pleased that this library that bears his name is hosting this conference. President Johnson wanted his library to be what he referred to always as a springboard for the future. And just as he fought for racial equality throughout the course of his presidency, I believe he would see repairing the racial divide that continues to exist in our country today as absolutely essential to our future. I also know that he would admire and appreciate the people who will grace this stage tonight, Madeleine Albright and Bryan Stevenson. When signing the Immigration Act of 1965, lifting the quotas that had long been in place, limiting immigration for those of many countries in the world, President Johnson said, and I quote, "A nation that was built by immigrants of all lands can ask those who now seek admission, what can you do for our country? But we should not be asking, in what country were you born?" There are few people who have done more for our country than Madeleine Albright. Secretary Albright, a naturalized American citizen, fled to the United States from Czechoslovakia with her family, escaping German occupation during World War II. Under President Bill Clinton, she was U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations from 1993 to 1997, and went on to serve as Secretary of State for this country from 1997 to 2001, becoming the first woman to hold that post. In a moment, Secretary Albright will engage in a conversation on the subject of immigration and a recent book entitled Fascism, A Warning. She'll engage in that conversation with LBJ Foundation President and CEO Mark Updegrove. Afterward, we will hear from Bryan Stevenson on what justice requires. President Johnson was intent on, in his words, moving equality as a fact as well as an ideal in America. And Mr. Stevenson has spent his entire career dedicated to that notion, challenging systemic biases against the poor and people of color. He is the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative and has received numerous awards, including the rare award of the MacArthur Foundation's Genius Grant. Later this year, his best-selling book, Just Mercy, will be released as a movie starring Michael B. Jordan and Jamie Foxx. Now we will begin the evening with Secretary Albright. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Madeleine Albright and Mark Updegrove.
Madam Secretary, welcome.
It's great to be here.
Well,
Thank
you do us
you.
great honor by being here. And I know we want to start off with a bit of housekeeping of sorts. Last time you were here around your wildly popular exhibit, Read My Pins. Inquiring minds want to know, what pins are you wearing this evening?
Well, I'm wearing my full Texas regalia, cowboy boots and a Stetson and the state emblem.
And it looks fabulous. It looks fabulous. Welcome. Larry Temple just mentioned that you are a naturalized American citizen. For those who might not know your story, can you talk about what your family's journey was in Europe and what led you to the United States of America after the war?
Yes, well, thank you. And I am really honored to be a part of this incredible summit and to have the opportunity to talk about immigration as part of the discussion here, because I think it very much is germane. So I was born in Prague, Czechoslovakia in 1937. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and he had been stationed in Yugoslavia as the press attaché, came back to Prague just in time for the Nazis to march in on March 1939. From reading about him a little bit more, by lying, he managed to get out with me and my mother, and we went to England, where the Czechoslovak government was in exile. So I spent the war in London all through the Blitz, and one of the things that was very germane in my life was that the United States was not present at something called the Munich Agreement in 1938, when the British and French made an agreement with the Germans and Italians and sold the country I was born in down the river. America was not there. But I remember really well when the Americans came. I was a little girl in London when the American military came, and it changed everything. After the war, we went back to Czechoslovakia, and my father ultimately was made a Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia after the war. So the little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport, that's what I did for a living. And then he was a professional diplomat, and what happened, his time in Yugoslavia was up, and he was given an assignment, or offered an assignment, which was on a new commission to do with India and Pakistan over Kashmir. And he was very happy to do that. And then there was the communist coup in Czechoslovakia in February 1948. And he didn't want to work for the communists. So what he did was go and ask his best friends in Belgrade, the British and American ambassadors, what to do. And they said, your country's just had a coup, and if you resign, they'll name some communist and nothing will ever happen. And so why don't you do it and report to us? So what happened is that's what he did. I don't have a terrible story about crawling through barbed wire to get to the United States. We came on diplomatic passports on the SS America, and I arrived on November 11th, 1948. My father came a little bit later after he had finished what he was doing, and he defected and asked for political asylum. And so at that stage, the Rockefeller Foundation was finding jobs for Central European intellectuals, and they found him a job at the University of Denver. And we had no idea where Denver was. So my parents bought a car, started driving across America, and my mother said, they say Denver's the mile-high city, but we're not going up, so maybe we're going the wrong direction. So anyway, he started teaching there, and I grew up in Denver. I didn't become a citizen until 1957, which was between my sophomore and junior year at Wellesley. And 59. What happened, and this is interesting because I now know a lot more about how the system works. My father begged for political asylum. I have a copy of the letter he wrote to Dean Acheson. But because it was the McCarthy era, and frankly, because there was something called the McCarran Act that in terms of immigration had slotted people from certain countries and didn't want anybody that had anything to do with communists, he had technically worked for communists. And so it took us much longer to get our citizenship than most people. McCarthy died in May 57. Right. And that summer is when I got my citizenship. And so, and at the courthouse in Denver, I was so grateful to be an American. I am grateful to be an American. That is how I describe myself. My father, when we came here, said the following thing. And he said, when we were in England, people were very kind to us. They would say, we're so sorry, your country's been taken over by a terrible dictator. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you? And when are you going home? When we came to the United States, people said, we're so sorry, your country's been taken over by a terrible system. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you? And when will you become a citizen? And my father said, that is what made America different from every country in the world.
So does that spirit, Madam Secretary, still exist in the United States, that welcoming spirit, that inclusiveness, are wanting you not only to feel at home, but to make this your home?
I think it does among the majority of people in the United States, because I do enough meetings and I talk to enough people to know that that generosity of spirit is there and that Americans are very proud of our diversity. I think that our public stature does not reflect that. And I think it's very hard because we are known for the Statue of Liberty and our sense of welcoming and the strength of our system because of the diversity. By the way, the first person to call me when I became Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger. And he said, Madeline, you have taken away my one unique characteristic of being an immigrant Secretary of State. And I said, no, Henry, I don't have an accent. So, but one of the things I love doing is to give people their naturalization certificates. The first time I did it was July 4th, 2000 at Monticello. I figured since I had Thomas Jefferson's job, I could do that. And so as I gave this man his naturalization certificate, I heard him as he walked away. He said, can you believe that I'm a refugee and I just got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State? So I went up to him and I said, can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State? And that, I think, is America's generosity and openness.
What has led to the xenophobia, the nativism that we're seeing in the United States today?
Well, I think I have tried to write about it a bit in my book. Some people say my book is alarming. It's supposed to be. And
this is very pointedly called Fascism, a Warning.
Yeah. And I was going to write this book no matter who had gotten elected because I was very troubled by things that I was seeing in the United States, which were divisions among us, some based on economic situation, some cultural issues, and hard to understand exactly technology. But I was troubled by the fact that there were divisions, and to go back to your first question, that there was kind of a less of a welcoming spirit. I'm trying to figure out what it was all about. And so I decided to look historically at what had happened in various countries when divisions came about. And the lessons obviously come out of Europe, and especially since I felt that my family story was very much affected by fascism. How did it happen and why did it happen in Europe? And so I go back and I begin historically with Mussolini. He was the first fascist. And the word fascism comes from Italian, the fasces that are kind of rods, and that has an axe in the middle of it. And what happened was that Mussolini, well, the Italians were very disappointed in the fact that even though they had fought on the Allied side during World War I, that their contribution was not recorded in an appropriate way, or people weren't grateful enough. There were divisions within Italy, and Mussolini was an outsider who came and was very smart in terms of really gathering people together, giving them hope, having answers for questions. And he, in fact, became, and this is the part that actually blew my mind as I did the research, he came to power constitutionally. Right. King Emmanuel was weak. He needed help from a popular leader, and he, in fact, selected and blessed, really, Mussolini. Hitler also came to power constitutionally by von Hindenburg, and it came again because the Germans were dissatisfied with the Versailles Treaty, reparations, the way they were seen, a financial crisis. And so these two historic leaders really came to power because of divisions, and because rather than trying to find a common answer, they exacerbated the divisions that were there. And it's very hard to define a fascist. By the way, it's a term that's kind of thrown around. Anybody who disagrees with you is a fascist. Or the teenage boy who is forbidden from driving his car by his father says his father's a fascist. So the hard thing was defining fascism. It's not an ideology, it's a process for taking power. Right. And the process begins by exacerbating that division and working off of it in order to identify himself, this leader, with what he sees as the majority of the people, some nationalist or tribalist kind of group, at the expense of another group, which then is blamed for what has gone on. So the scapegoating. And that is the way that it progressed, and the way that we see a lot of that going on in countries now. I have been talking in the book mostly It's about the current countries that I am saying are aiming towards fascism. One is Hungary, Poland, Turkey, the Philippines, Venezuela are the ones that I talk about. And by the way, all of those leaders were elected. And that, I think, surprised me in terms of the constitutionality and the election. I do think communists are fascists also. They actually had a revolution, the Soviet one and the Chinese one. But I think mostly it's that lesson of divisions that are exacerbated and a leader who has answers that gets put in office. By the way, the best quote in the book is from Mussolini, who says, if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody will notice. So there's a lot of feather plucking going on now. By the way, you can't say those two words together too quickly. No.
There were also a lot of bald chickens running around Europe at a certain time. There are two things that struck me in reading this book. And by the way, I would call it fascism an endorsement. You must read this book.
No.
I was telling the secretary, I read so slowly, you can see my lips move, but I read this in 2 days. But what struck me is these leaders were legitimate, to your point, either elected into office or put in constitutionally. The other thing was that fascism started with Mussolini during the industrial age, when there was a certain feeling of alienation among folks. And it also struck me that there is an alienation that people feel in the digital age. Has that led to this, again, this rise in nativism that we've seen, this xenophobia?
I think so, because people are unclear about what their role in life is. How do they really relate to their work? Are they needed in a society, or are they extraneous? And the Industrial Revolution clearly made some people feel that way. I think that what is going on now definitely has that feeling. By the way, I sometimes like to talk about the fact that there are two mega trends that are going on, and they both have their downside. So the first one is globalization, and I think globalization is not a four-letter word, but it's basically a word that does, for many people, describe progress, of really being a part of a much larger story and being able to travel and have goods from different countries. But it does have a downside. It's faceless. And people want to know what their identity is in terms of religion or language or ethnic background. And that's fine. I think that often leads to patriotism. However, when it leads to nationalism and hyper-nationalism, where my identity hates your identity, it's very dangerous. And we're seeing that now in a number of places. Europe, for instance. One can argue that the bureaucrats in Brussels are faceless, and they are off, ordering up a bunch of regulations, and the countries don't want to be told what to do, and it's gotten to be hyper-nationalism. Right. The other mega trend is technology, which is incredible in terms of what it has done to connect us. And I also love to talk about the Kenyan woman farmer who no longer has to walk miles to pay her bills. She can just do it with her mobile phone, right. And it's changed her life. I mean, she can have a life, she can be with her family, she can go to school, she can start a business. It's totally changed. But what it has also done is disaggregate voices. Everybody kind of is in their echo chamber, and they get their information through that, and it's very hard to kind of come together in a positive way to deal with their problems. And a perfect example, by the way, of that is what's happened in Egypt, for instance. So people were summoned to Tahrir Square by social media. They get there, they don't have a clue what to do. And I'm always, I believe in elections, but I think the election that happened in Egypt came too soon. The Muslim Brotherhood was organized. The people in Tahrir Square were not. Right. The Muslim Brotherhood wins because of that social disconnect. And so that is the problem. And then I made up this middle-aged man who wants to come into Cairo to open his stall in the marketplace, and Cairo's a mess, and he says, to hell with this, I want order. And all of a sudden they have a military government. Right. And to describe the technology aspect thing, I have to say this is a totally plagiarized line, which one shouldn't use at a university, but basically it describes everything very well. I learned it in Silicon Valley. and that is that people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and provide 19th century responses. So there is no faith in government and institutions. And so that's why people are attracted to somebody that gives simple answers.
Right. The President Johnson said after signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act that it was not only the most important domestic policy of that year, it was the most important foreign policy because it showed the world that we were willing to take action to stand up for our egalitarian ideals. What is the demonization of Mexicans on our southern border due to our reputation abroad?
I have to think of a polite word. I think it hurts us incredibly. I have spent a lot of time abroad at various meetings and conferences, and I have to say the most recent one I went to was a conference on immigration run by the UN in Morocco, and it was run by a Canadian, Louise Arbour, and so she invited me to speak. And I look out at the audience, and the chair for the United States government was empty. The Russians and the Chinese were there. We were not there. The United States is AWOL, dealing on this particular, on many issues, but certainly that one. And so then I was asked a lot of questions, what is going on? Why are you all of a sudden separating mothers from their children? Why? I thought you were, you've been such a welcoming country to everybody. What has happened to you? The other part that puts us in a very bad position, I do think the Europeans have behaved very badly towards the immigrants and refugees that are coming. It puts us in a position where we can't possibly tell the Hungarians or whomever, you need to take more people, especially since we're not taking people and have a ban on a variety of Muslim countries. So it is very hard for us to have the role that I believe I'm kind of hokey about America. I really do think we are the indispensable nation. And there is nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It means we need to be engaged with partners, and without our leadership, there's a vacuum created, and our reputation sinks with that, as we are viewed, as President Johnson talked about, I think, as an incredible country in terms of our, not the Civil Rights Bill, and obviously what he also signed on immigration, a pride in the diversity of this country and the strength of its country, and a recognition of what people from different places give to each other. And embarrassing is not a strong enough word for what it is like to go and try to explain what is happening on our border. It is not American.
On Twitter, you responded to President Trump's proclamation that our country is closed by tweeting, "Our country isn't full, and ironically, Homeland Security is empty." How so?
Well, first of all, I do think I have traveled across this country an awful lot, not just by airplane, but by car. We have so much room. There is no question. And it's beautiful, you know. I have looked at the Statue of Liberty. She's not full. And so I see that as it's a lie. I mean, we are not full. I do think I am troubled by what has happened at Homeland Security. And by the way, the interesting part about it, it was a department that didn't exist until 9/11. And it's a very complicated department. I love teaching about decision-making in our government, and that it was very hard to create the department because it took pieces of other departments and kind of tried to pull things together. And to create a brand new department is not a simple one, but especially one that has such a complicated mandate in terms of dealing with disasters, the immigration questions, a number of law issues, and to have it without leadership. And it isn't just the leader. From everything that I've read, there are a lot of people that have left. But it's also, there are other departments in the U.S. government that are without a permanent cabinet member. And I can tell you that our decision-making process depends on often a whole-of-government approach, that you have to be in the Situation Room with the other cabinet members to really actually state disagreements, because a government benefits from having people that don't all agree initially and then who try to, and compromise is definitely not a four-letter word. So I think it's very important. That's gone, and that troubles me. But the fact that a department that is actually responsible for dealing with those kinds of issues, not just the border, but FEMA and various things, and it wasn't easy to establish, and so I think the emptiness of it is a symbol of how we regard our government. And one of the things, just to go back on one of the original issues, I think that one of the problems that creates the divisions in our societies and the world is the breakdown of the social contract. What happened was that people, I mean, this is a political philosophy question always, but basically people gave up their individual rights in order to be protected by the state. And there is a co-responsibility. The state has to take certain measures to protect the people and provide a variety of services. But the citizens are not only is it a privilege to vote, but a responsibility. Right. And so that relationship is not working at the moment. And I think that that's one of the things that has to be worked on in terms of how to solve problems together. And then if there's a vacuum and a problem, then somebody takes over. Right. And we can't, I don't believe we can do without a government. I think it's, you can't have it empty in Washington.
I'll go back to our southern border in a moment, but you talked about the changes in Homeland Security, and certainly there's going to be a change with Kirstjen Nielsen's departure. What does the State Department look like now versus when you were there?
First of all, let me say what is interesting is, in case you haven't guessed, I loved being Secretary of State. And I often say that I was the last Secretary of State of the 20th century and the first of the 21st. The only problem was I started saying it about 6 months after President Clinton named me, which was really presumptuous that he would keep me the 4 years. He did keep me the 4 years, so I am. But basically, there was a question
Very
about
wisely.
How diplomacy works. I think we were talking about this a little while ago. I do teach at Georgetown, and I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And no matter how powerful we are, there are not a lot of tools in the toolbox. There's diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. There are the economic tools, the trade and aid and sanctions, the threat of the use of force, intelligence, and law enforcement. That's it. And statecraft is trying to figure out what order you pick up the tools and how you work. But diplomacy is the basic tool. And the State Department is the one that uses it, both bilaterally and multilaterally. You actually need diplomats to do diplomacy. And so part of what's happening is there are fewer diplomats. Some of the people have left because they were not respected. And some of the, sometimes my students, they say, should I take the Foreign Service exam? I don't agree with the policy. And I said, guess what? You're not going to be making policy for a while. You're going to be stamping visas. But the bottom line is you need to get into the system because we will not have a pipeline. But I think that there is kind of a sense that the State Department is not respected. And some of it is translated into the budget. So the budget this year for the defense, and I am for a military budget, I'm very supportive of the military, is around $718 billion. The budget for the State Department is like $45 billion. That doesn't make a lot of sense, since you have to pay for having the diplomats and the security of the buildings and the programs. And it's really kind of lowering the estimate of the State Department and diplomacy, and undermining a very basic tool for the country. So it's, I think, very short-sighted. By the way, the interesting part is there are not a lot of secretaries of state, and we are all friends. And I know that some people watch Madam Secretary. And so what happened...
They're watching her now?
What happened was that when the show started, Taylor called me up and she wanted to know what it was like to be Secretary of State. And so we spent some time talking about it. Then I was on the show, but most recently I was on it with Secretary Powell and Secretary Clinton. And the whole thing was scripted, obviously, but I managed to get in one line that they left. And we've been summoned to the State Department because there's been a horrendous thing at the White House. And I managed to get in. Isn't it nice when the current Secretary of State consults her predecessors? We used to do that all the time.
I want to quote you in Fascism, A Warning. You write, "I am often asked if I am an optimist or a pessimist. My reply is, I'm an optimist who worries a lot. I continue to believe that the United States banked enough international goodwill in the interval years between George Washington and Barack Obama to recover from the present embarrassment," a word you used earlier. "But I'm not sure how extensive or lasting the harm will be, hence the worries." What are the manifestations of the harm you see in our reputation abroad long term? I mean, in your view, and I understand clearly that you don't know what the long-term effects would be, but what are you seeing now that would lead to that worry?
Well, I mentioned the conference in Morocco, which was symptomatic of it, but I do think that the world is moving on. They don't wait for us to get our act together, and this is a very fluid kind of time in terms of international relationships of all kind. Nobody talks about China anymore without saying rising. They are definitely a power to be reckoned with, and they are moving into the vacuum that we have left. They have several policies that are kind of pulled together, and they're called One Belt, One Road, in order to restructure a relationship that basically was the Silk Road, but now extends much further in terms of creating relationships with other countries by, in fact, investing in them or giving them loans or buying ports and doing any number of things. Or in Africa, specifically, they will, I've been in Africa enough to know how they do this, is, for instance, in Kenya, there was a question about building a road through the Serengeti, and Americans would say, well, we need to know the environmental aspects of it, and the Chinese come in and say, where do you want it? And in exchange, they take minerals and really are exploiting the various African countries, and or they do something called the debt trap, is that in the end, the X country owes them a lot of money, but they are not just doing this in developing world, they're doing it in the developed world. They've just bought a port in Italy. They have, in fact, and in Greece. They are now helping the Venezuelans, and they are filling in where we are not. So that's one part. They've developed a separate development bank and are just filling the vacuum. The truth is the Russians are also taking advantage of it. We are dealing in Russia with a KGB agent. He knows how to do propaganda, and they are systematically undermining the countries in Central and Eastern Europe by militarizing information and disrupting their election systems. And so they are taking, doing what we're not in a number of different places. And as we question the validity of NATO, they are, rubbing their hands with delight. They are also in Venezuela all of a sudden. And so I think I could go on, but it's basically that there are those who are replacing us. And I know Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables, but it ends in an ism. But the Chinese are all of a sudden the multilateralists.
Right.
They are contributing to peacekeeping operations. They're talking about the dangers of climate change, nuclear proliferation. And so the world isn't waiting for us to get our act together. And I am very worried about how we re-enter, because for Americans' good, we need, for our national interest, we need to have a foreign policy, a national security policy that protects Americans, which can be done by having partners in terms of dealing with the problems out there. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out nuclear proliferation is dangerous, and you can't do that unilaterally. Climate change is real. The Earth is not flat. And I think that we need to understand that. Or the spread of disease. If you just read what's going on with Ebola and trade. So I think that we need to figure out how to return to the scene as a responsible country that is not AWOL on national security.
Let me go back to back to our southern border. Our president has deemed the situation on our southern border a crisis necessitating presidential action. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a crisis that necessitates that action, where are we? What kind of situation is it? And how should we look upon the southern border?
Well, I don't put it in terms of crisis like a national security crisis, but it is a humanitarian crisis. I think that is making life impossible for people that don't have a choice in many ways. I have to say, I describe myself as a grateful American, but most people would prefer to live in the country where they're born if they could make a living and be with their families. And so people are not kind of getting into groups of people to trudge through horrible situations or boats to come and be separated from their families. They're terrified of where they are. And so in order to make things even worse, this administration has cut off assistance to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the triangle where the people are coming from, and making it worse. In addition, what we could be doing is actually giving them assistance, but also the current government of Mexico is relatively friendly towards the United States and cares about human rights a lot. We could be offering help to them in terms of figuring out how to get them to be able to deal with the people that are coming in. We could also expand the number of ways that we deal with the people that are coming in. Right. The empty part is a problem in that we could have more people in the processing and border patrol and control. I do think that every country has a right to have an immigration process, a comprehensive process. President Johnson certainly signed that agreement for that reason. And I mean, he changed the way things were looked at in terms of the kinds of people that could come in. We should have a comprehensive immigration bill. So it is, I don't think there's a danger from this. The people that are coming in are not killers. The people are tragically trying to find a life. But it is a humanitarian tragedy that should not happen on America's borders.
Right. I'm going to quote you again in Fascism, a Warning. You write, "The story of America's birth has always been powerful enough to overcome internal contradictions. Americans have never ceased to learn from mistakes, in part because every generation has had the ideal of equality against which to measure itself." So how is this current generation of Americans doing against that ideal?
Well, first of all, let me say, the reason that I wrote the way I did is that democracy, it's a little bit of a contradiction, is both fragile and resilient. And one of the things my father said when he came here, he said he was so grateful to be here, but he also said that he was concerned that Americans took democracy for granted. And that is the part that I'm worried about. And so, you know, one of the things when I talk about my book, I think we all know the see something, say something. I have added to that do something. And on my to-do list is the fact that we are in charge of our lives in terms of correcting mistakes. And I do think we need to recognize we can't normalize things that are not normal in terms of attacks on the judiciary or the press is essential for a free country. And I do think that people need to be politically involved, either running themselves or supporting those. Then the other part I believe strongly about, I actually don't like the word tolerance because that means put up with. I would like us to talk to the people with whom we disagree, to really find out what is going on, why, and not be condescending and try to figure out how to talk to everybody and sort. But the main thing, there's never been a book or a speech that's been written that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So Robert Frost, the quote I like is, "The older I get, the younger are my teachers." And so I do think that what is important is for the younger generation to recognize the responsibility of citizenship and to be really involved. I was moved, as I think many people were just a year ago, with the Parkland kids that got out there and really showed us. And I think that we need to recognize that a lot of things need to be fixed. A lot of institutions, as I said, I would have written this book no matter what. It is the 70th anniversary of many things. And one is NATO, for instance, and the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. And at a certain age, people and institutions need a little refurbishing. So I think we need to be more conscious about the institutional structures and what our responsibilities are to fix them. You know, we could rely on the millennials. I call myself a perennial. And so I think that we need to have cross-generational work together.
Right.
Yeah.
You are an optimist who worries a lot. We heard a little bit about your worries, but as you look at the future of this country, what is at the root of your optimism?
The root of my optimism is what doesn't change in this country, which is Americans are optimistic. That's the interesting part. I have gone to a number of countries and given speeches, and one of the things, by the way, when I was there, having been born in Czechoslovakia, to welcome them when they got into NATO, and I get off the stage, and the man that was Prime Minister, Václav Klaus, comes up to me and says, because I keep wondering what is Czech and what is American, and so he said, only an American could have given that speech because it's so optimistic. And I do think that Americans are by nature optimistic. Also, that we have not changed in, I think, our personal relationships with each other. And if we question them, that's why this summit is so important. Because I think the discussions about race, they have to be made. We have to have the discussion. We have to understand ourselves. And I think the desire to do it is important. But for me, the main thing is that we need the optimism and our history, and that we understand where we've come from, and we understand that it takes action to know where we're going. Right. And I am optimistic about the young people. I really am. And the fact that they want to understand, I just met with some students in terms of, and I always like it in terms of the questions they ask, their desire to make a difference, and trying to figure out how to make a difference. And maybe some of us that have screwed it up can help them make a difference.
The book is Fascism, A Warning. The perennial is Secretary Madeleine Albright. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all.
Madam Secretary, what a delight this was.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was fun.
That was fun.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Good. Thank you.
I